All right, now let's talk about economic evolution after Marx. And there's going to be several thinkers. We can consider these guys mostly free enterprise, kind of capitalist proponents. They disagree with Marx's theory of history beyond capitalism. They don't consider capitalism as having internal contradictions that will lead to its demise, ushering in socialism and eventually communism. They may, however, agree that capitalism is unsustainable, and that's going to be key because many of these free market capitalist thinkers, they are proponents of capitalism. They like capitalism. They think it's the optimal economic system, but they may be pessimistic about its sustainability. They may actually agree with Marx in the sense that capitalism will diminish and eventually make way for a socialist movement, but not for the same reasons. Let's start with Joseph Schumpeter. Now, he's most famous for the concept of creative destruction. And this is the idea that in a capitalist free market system, you're going to have a lot of competition, and these firms are going to compete to attract customers. They're going to do that by trying to produce a higher quality product at a lower cost. Those that are really good at doing that are going to get business, and those that are not are going to lose business. And over time, superior firms are going to outcompete and replace inferior firms. So he sees capitalism as dynamic, which means it's always changing. He sees it as innovative because it's changing in ways that are guided by the consumer. Consumers want Amazon, they don't want Sears. So what do we get in the marketplace? We get Amazon, we lose Sears. Consumers want a car and not a horse and buggy. So what do we get in the marketplace? We get a car and not a horse and buggy. But for Schumpeter, the destructive element here is creative because we are losing stuff, but we're getting something more. And it is these capitalist market forces that are driving this process. So he's a big proponent of this economic system. But he also recognizes that there's going to be a capitalist struggle, right? These entrepreneurs, they're not going to like competing. And so they're going to have this constant threat to their profits from other firms. And they're not just going to go out and try to outcompete by producing a better product at a lower price. Some of them are going to seek state protection. They're going to look at the government and they're going to see a means to protect them from competition. And once they do that, capitalism in its pristine form is lost. You can actually see this if you look at the banking industry, where 150 years ago, the banking industry was much smaller with many more firms competing to attract customers. But over time, those smaller banks started to consolidate into bigger banks, which gave them more influence in Washington, which then created hurdles for new banks to come into the marketplace. Where today, if you want to start a bank, you probably need $40–50 million just to get the government approval to do it. So Schumpeter would say, that's a barrier to entry that keeps competition in banking lower and benefits the big banks, the JP Morgans, and the Wells Fargos and the Bank of Americas. So that's one example. Another example is in the professions. At one time, in order to become a doctor, attorney, or accountant, you would find somebody that was in that business, and then you would go to work for them. You trade your time for knowledge. So they would mentor you, you'd be the apprentice, and then eventually you would develop the skill set they had and branch off on your own. Well, this created a lot more competition. And many people inside these professions, they didn't want the competition. So they started to get together and form various unions and trade organizations like the American Medical Association in order to lobby the government to make it harder to become a professional. Now, you might be saying, but this benefits the consumer because it raises the standard for competency. And that's very possible. But some would argue that not having people in an actual real world setting doing that job lowers the competency. Is it better, for example, for a doctor to learn how to be a doctor in a school or to actually go into a hospital and work under an existing doctor, assisting them one-on-one? That debate goes on. What we know is there's likely two incentives to increase the requirement, rigor, to become a professional. One is to protect people from incompetent practitioners, and the other is to protect people that are in those positions from competition. And it's not always easy to delineate between the two. Schumpeter is very concerned when the insiders protect their own professions and businesses from competition, use government in a nefarious way to keep competition out. Because what he sees is corporatism, right? This kind of lobbying for government support and protection. It creates corruption, where not only is it corrupt for the businesses to kind of get in bed with government, but it also corrupts the political system because they're suddenly accountable not to the masses of people that are out there voting in a democratic system, but to the few corporations that actually have the means to support politicians and political contributions and so forth. That means that the economic system suffers because we move from capitalism and competition to corporatism, but the political system also suffers because we can no longer trust that the leaders are making decisions in the best interests of the masses of people, but maybe catering and pandering to the big businesses. This causes society's affection for capitalism to diminish. And Schumpeter would say it's not capitalism that caused this, it's corporatism. It's a perversion of capitalism by the business owners and professionals using government for protection. But society doesn't discern between the two. They see capitalism, they see income and wealth inequality. They see unfair outcomes because suddenly you can't just go out and start a business and move up and cater to customers and, say, I'm going to do better than that other company and I'm going to get all their customers. You can't do that anymore because now you got to partner with government. You have to overcome those hurdles that the big businesses have created for you. And for a lot of people, that can't happen. And you don't have to look far to see this. If you go to the bigger countries, like bigger in terms of productivity, like the US or some of the countries in Europe, you'll see going into business is actually more challenging than if you go to the poorer countries, like in East Asia or in India. It's actually quite common in poor countries for very poor people to start businesses. That's how they survive. But in the US, that'd be very uncommon, right? You almost have to have a lot of money in order to overcome those hurdles to get into business. And that's the problem that Joseph Schumpeter is pointing out. As a result of this, society will expand the role of government, ironically, to correct the perceived failures of capitalism. If the masses don't delineate between capitalism and corporatism, then they blame capitalism and they look to the alternative, big government, to correct that. So he believes government's going to grow and socialism will emerge as an alternative to rebalance the economy because people are focused on what they see as the unfair outcomes and the inequality. And if you believe that comes from free market capitalism, then you need to get rid of free market capitalism, which takes us to socialism. But Schumpeter says they're misguided, right? They're mistaken. Right? It's not capitalism, it's corporatism. And you don't get rid of that by making the government bigger. You actually get rid of it by making the government smaller, where there is no reason for big business to partner with government because government has no real power in the economy. So Schumpeter believes that capitalism is the optimal economic system. He likes capitalism. He just doesn't think it's going to be sustainable because of its tarnished image due to corporatism. He says if a doctor predicts that his patient will die presently, it does not mean that he desires it. Next, let's move on to Hayek. Like Schumpeter, Hayek believes that capitalism is the optimal economic system. However, he also believes that it may be hard to sustain. In 1944, his Road to Serfdom was published. This says that democratic societies face the regular choice of collectivism or individualism in the form of legislative mandates. You can think of collectivism as socialism and individualism as capitalism. And the individual now becomes subjugated by the state. That's why he calls it the road to serfdom. We're going down the path of being managed by a central authority. The justification becomes social welfare. So if the market fails to provide everybody with an education, then the government takes over the education system and provides it to everybody. If the market fails to provide everybody with healthcare, then the government takes over the healthcare system and provides everybody with healthcare. Now that undoubtedly sounds good to a lot of people, but understand that you haven't eliminated the economic problem of scarcity. You've just changed who's in charge of allocating those resources. In the marketplace, capitalism, individual consumers, through their purchasing patterns, determine who produces, the businesses that exist and don't exist, and who gets the good, those that are willing to pay versus those that are not willing to pay. Whereas in collectivism, the government determines who's in charge of production and who gets the goods. There is always going to be an insufficient amount of healthcare for society, whether we provide it through consumer decision making, capitalism, or through government decision making, socialism. But we have to recognize that both come with trade-offs. And for Hayek, the trade-off that we make moving away from individualism to collectivism is a trade-off that is damaging to the masses. Everyone will get healthcare, everyone will get education, but the quality and quantity will diminish because socialism does not have the same incentives for production and efficiency that capitalism does. And that means people should recognize that this pursuit of social welfare by expanding the role of government comes at a cost that may not be worth it. He believes they don't see that. He compares it to a siren, the beautiful siren sitting on the shore, waving in the unsuspecting sea crew. That's the way he sees the state. They're selling you social welfare. They're selling you equality. They're selling you justice, but they're doing so as a way of getting you to give them more power and control over your lives. And by the time you realize it was a ruse to lure you in, it's too late. Once they have more power, they will then start to manage other decisions in your life. They won't just manage that you get health care. They'll manage your personal behavior to ensure there's enough health care available for everyone. For example, in a capitalist system, if you choose to smoke, you would have to pay more for health insurance because you would be increasing the cost of providing health care. But in a socialist system, everyone would get health care. So if you are a smoker, you would still be increasing the cost of providing health care, but they would manage that by banning smoking. You don't have to look far to see this. One example is when Bloomberg became the mayor of New York City, one of his first orders was banning big gulps in New York City. Why? Because he saw big gulps as a personal decision that were adding to government-sponsored healthcare. Another example is in the state of California, it is illegal to ride a motorcycle without a helmet. Why? Because people that don't ride helmets end up raising the cost of government-provided healthcare. In both instances, if the government is involved in providing healthcare, they have more discretion in managing personal decisions. And for Hayek, this is the trade-off. This is the siren. You're going to get healthcare. Come in. It's great. And then all of a sudden you realize government, politicians are making personal decisions for you. Of course, healthcare is just one example. The same model applies to other industries. If you have government education provided, everyone's going to get it, but parents are going to have less control over what is taught. Politicians will determine that, so on and so forth. All right, we'll pick up in the next video.